10. Our main speaker, Doru, is a Romanian Orthodox priest and patristic scholar. He's working now at St. Cyril's Theological College, St. Cyril's Coptic Orthodox College. He is the founding director of the Australian Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies. He's widely published and making a great contribution, personal contribution to the SCD's research profile. The title of his paper is Affirming Creation's Goodness in a Time of Pandemic, Patristic Insights. I may suggest you might want to put it into speaker view if you can, and then we'll have a good view of our speaker, whom I now hand over. Over to you, Doru.
Thank you very much, Neil. And hello, everyone. You already know the topic. I'll begin by reading my motto. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. Perhaps you recognize C.S. Lewis's famous sentence about Aslan, the creator. So things that are both good and terrible. And people that haven't been to Narnia have no idea how's that coming. And now I move to my paper. The early Christians may have lived in a pre-critical age, as we judge them reassuring ourselves, but they were far from uncritical and undiscerning. Their sense of reality in all its complexity was sharper than our own, which explained why they could both assess things and handle crisis better than we do. People might feel uneasy about the opening lines of my essay, desiring to contradict me. Of course, they are free to do so. However, before they do so, let's just think of how the first world reacted to the unfolding crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. From the irresponsibility of certain Western leaders to the tragic loss of life registered in their very countries and elsewhere in North America and Europe, down to the restlessness of our own compatriots who are ready to die for a night out. The first world displays traits of what I can only call childishness, blindness, and stupidity. We may reassure ourselves as much as we like, but the evidence stares us in the face. We behave like restless children, unable to take a break from our frenzied and more often than not pointless activities, to breathe in, to breathe out, and to look into ourselves realistically in a moment of peace. Irresponsibility and restlessness are a match made in heaven, indeed, but they do not lend substance to our reassuring image of ourselves as the mature exemplars of a critical age. Above all, irresponsibility and restlessness make plain our lack of preparation for the possibility of the unexpected. We all heard of an earthquake here, a tsunami there, and a catastrophic storm yet elsewhere. We all heard of famine, war, pestilence, and death. But none of it concerns us, for we live in the perfect world, the land of opportunity, and the lucky country, where none of it seems possible. It is at this juncture that becomes obvious the third element of our first world algorithm, namely our unreasonableness, irresponsibility, restlessness, and unreasonableness. From wishing one another all good things to expecting only good things to happen is a far cry. Yet we still do. That is, we do expect all good things to happen. I propose that our unreasonableness, together with its mates, irresponsibility and restlessness, have their origin in a shallow worldview. As it happens, Christians and secular people are no different on this count. While drawing on their respective assumptions, both present the symptoms of the same health issue. Pardon my pun. Apart from considering with suspicion people's blind trust in the system which serves us from the beginning of the modern era, especially our technological capability to bend things according to our own designs, I would not presume to understand the secular mind and the agnostic take on reality. Bearing in mind this caveat, I tend to believe that it is this misplaced trust in the system's knowledge and power that fooled people in the early days of the coronavirus outbreak, as it did on many other occasions in the past. There is indeed a downside to the system we created and to the mindset it inspires. Blind trust in the system dulls people's wits, blunts their discernment, making them irresponsible and unreasonable in their expectations. And people expect only good things to happen, the enemy, that is nature, being brought to its knees by our technological might. But the secular optimistic narrative has serious flaws. It is shallow, a sandcastle and a house of cards. Knowledge and power keep letting us down. The system cracks. It happened in the past, and it happens under our very eyes. And when the system fails, people are left as they are, utterly unprepared, both psychologically and emotionally. Hence their irresponsible reactions and restlessness. What I might understand better is why certain Christians who in theory have faith and wisdom to guide them behave as unreasonably as their secular and agnostic neighbors. It seems to me that they infer the wrong conclusions from the doctrine of creation. Specifically, many believe that God, whom they represent as the sum of all possible perfections, had created the best of all possible worlds, and that, consequently, there is no place for bad things to happen. If bad things do happen, they happen to sinners, rightly so. In turn, the righteous have no reason to fear and can go by their business as usual. And of course, at the end of all things, they will necessarily go to heaven. No room for bad news. No place for the unexpected in the worldview of the righteous. Just winged angels and apple crumble pies. I love that, actually. But I'm not a righteous person, I assume. And if sometimes the righteous remember the fall of each and every one of us, for we all fit the bill of our paradisal forebears to a T, read Romans 5:12. Their misguided faith in the Lord's salvation prevents them from assessing things realistically. No wonder that people who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time, as C.S. Lewis characteristically had it. In short, blind faith renders most Christians as unprepared for the unexpected as trust in the system and technology does their secular and agnostic neighbors. Well, I began on this note. It's more of a pamphlet than a research paper, of course, in the hope that I whet your appetite for what comes next, which is a bit of a different story. I sort of thought that I should begin in this way because one of our objectives, our goals, is not only to boost research culture in the SCD, as we discussed in the preparatory sessions. We also want to build a bridge between the world of theological research and, well, let's call it the real world. That world where we encounter issues of this kind, the kind that I described, perhaps ironically or jokingly, in the earlier pages. And now I turn to the core of my paper. Not so the early Christians, on whose worldview I focus in what follows, sampling the Greek tradition. By the way, I have references from now on in my paper, but they are mainly to primary sources, what we call patristic literature or early Christian literature. I managed to reuse here some of my prior research, so there are references throughout my paper to work that I did in the past, and hopefully I'll be able to develop this paper by bringing in more guns to embellish the apparatus first of all, and then to address some issues that I actually encountered already in secondary sources in my own research. For them, for the early Christians, the only good news was the Lord's unwavering love. Read Romans chapter 8, verses from the 38th to the 39th. Not earthly rewards for righteousness. What they expected were not peace, good health, and prosperity. Instead, they were to face afflictions, hardship, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, and sword. And this is a string of tests and temptations. I borrow from John 16, verse 33, and Romans 8, verse 35. They knew furthermore, and here I come one step closer to my topic, that the creation itself, while scarred by people's sins, still journeys towards perfection, its future glory. Romans 8, verses from the 18th to the 23rd. They realized that the world was imperfect, a paradox. The Creator's perfection did not result in a perfect creation. Legitimately, therefore, since they believed in God's perfection, they asked themselves whether the Creator was unwilling to grant it also to his own creation. This became a serious question from the 2nd century onwards, when several Gnostic groups proposed pessimistic views of reality. For these Gnostics, the world was the imperfect outcome of an unwilling deity. A little later, the Manichaeans downright affirmed that the world was the creation of an evil God. We find ourselves with these heretical movements of late antiquity at the other end of the spectrum from the optimistic outlook of contemporary people, Christians and otherwise. Mainstream early Christians, or apostolic Christians, however, address the imperfections of the world in a couple of ways, neither of which resembles the two extremes mentioned in the foregoing. To their solutions I must now turn. In the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria, who died around 254, fought hard to prove that the imperfections, the disparity, and the suffering present in the world were our own doing, not a natural defect of the creation. While this approach seemed justified to him at the time, it has not been widely accepted. In fact, a century later, Athanasius of Alexandria, who died in 373, was among the first to point out that the material stuff of the universe is by nature incapable of perfection, whereas the Creator calls the creation to inherit charismatic immortality. His position seems to have expressed the view of many early Christians, who did not expect the creation to be the best of all possible worlds. As we read in the New Testament, here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for that city that is to come, or the city that is to come. Hebrews 13 verse 14. Apart from the polemical instances where he endeavored to keep God above all suspicion, Origen himself believed that the universe, having a beginning of its existence, could not be perfect and immortal by nature, depending on God's power to sustain it in existence and to lead it to a glorious condition at the eschaton. This conviction was consistent with his view that all things within the universe and the cosmos itself, visible and invisible, are in a continuous state of transition and change. But the universe does not move pointlessly. It moves towards a steady state and a superior condition following a threefold schema, from beginning through the middle to the end, a pattern which Origen derived by contemplating nature. Natural contemplation is a spiritual exercise that many early Christian theologians continued to do in the footsteps of the classical schools of philosophy. This schema suggests that creation's perfection, while promised from before the ages, pertains to the future, not to the universe's past or present. Centuries after Origen, and conversing with his thinking, Maximus the Confessor, who died in 662, outlined creation's movement according to the same schema. As with Origen, Maximus's intention was to assert cosmic perfection as an eschatological goal. Athanasius himself adopted Origen's understanding of reality, which he deployed within a discourse on divine providence. Since the universe was of necessity, I quote, weak, fluid, and mortal, it required continuous divine support. For both Alexandrine authors, God's providence worked with creation's weak mold and did so justly and gently, sensitive to its natural parameters. But what matters here is the sense of Origen and Athanasius that the stuff of which the world is made does not allow for perfection, at least not in its current condition, and definitely not without permanent divine assistance. It is this awareness of the universe's ontological imperfection, together with its dependence on God's permanent activity, which led the early Christians to appraise things realistically. Thus, on the one hand, they did not expect only good things to happen in the world, but on the other hand, they remained free of fear. On both counts, the reactions of contemporary Christians and secular people alike are equally inferior, as they oscillate between irresponsible confidence and the depths of fright and despair. The realism of the early Christians did not end here, though. Stemming from their sense of creation's imperfections, they openly discussed nature's ambiguity as such and in regard to human safety. But before I turn to this specific matter, it is noteworthy that at times, and very early on, they considered nature's ambiguity by way of metaphors. Such is again the case of Origen. His interpretation of the fifth day of creation in Genesis 1 draws symbolic parallels between aquatic and aerial animals on the one hand, and sins and virtues, respectively, on the other hand. Thus, aquatic life signifies sinfulness, while the birds stand for virtue. What prompted this interpretation is not difficult to grasp. Aquatic life, especially the great whales, as he calls them, are as deceiving as the waters themselves, hiding from our sight, being fully adjusted to their natural milieu, whereas the birds are free and perfectly visible. Origen also associated ethical symbols with the terrestrial animals of the sixth day of creation. Corresponding to the great whales, terrestrial animals signify human base impulses, while the human being's upright position, evoking the freedom of the birds, denotes a capacity for transcending instincts and vices. You'll see that this ethical symbolic turned to be very interesting and important at a later stage, and although not many late ancient and early medieval authors return to this kind of symbolistic, associating animals and vices or virtues, they actually believe that what was at stake many times, including in times of pandemics and other kind of catastrophes, was also the inequality of the human being, of the human person. Our virtues and our sins affect nature. That was their belief, and therefore they fought against catastrophes, if you like, by shaping their own lives. Beyond the strange symbolic of the examples presented by Origen, one might discern an ambiguity about animal life. There are lights and shadows in the Earth's biosphere, beauty and ugliness, tameness and wildness, which justify his parallels. But his interpretation entails a problem. Were these things not all created by God and judged good? That's what we read in Genesis 1, yeah? Everything was good. To address this matter in homilies on Genesis, Origen avoided the profoundly speculative explanations he provided elsewhere on the Principles, understanding goodness as usefulness. This was a very original way of looking at things. In this light, what seems evil might not be quite so. Even negative situations are good when, for example, they give opportunity to the saints to better themselves through withstanding temptations, tests, and turmoil. This is just one example. Origen's interpretation of goodness as usefulness reappears a century later in the thinking of Basil of Caesarea, who died in 379. Upon interpreting God's assessment of creation's goodness or beauty, since the Septuagint's word kalos means both, so what you have in the Hebrew Bible, tov or tob, good, is in Greek rendered as kalos, and it means both things, goodness and beauty. So, upon interpreting God's assessment of creation's goodness or beauty, Basil observed, I quote, "Beauty is that which is brought to perfection according to the principle of art, and which contributes to the usefulness of its end." There's no beauty without usefulness for him. For example, plant life is useful directly and indirectly by providing people with food and by feeding animals useful to us. Basil returned to vegetation's usefulness in a passage where he upfront discussed the ambiguity, or I should say, the complex facets of the biosphere. There he showed that the same divine commandment, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation," produced both nourishing and poisonous plants. The fact that certain plants prove to be either poisonous or useless to us does not mean that they have no purpose. In his words, "There is not one plant without worth, not one without use. Either it provides food for some animal, or it has been sought out for us by the medical profession for the relief of certain diseases." No one has therefore a reason for begrudging God. The usefulness of things, even indirect, I quote, "has proved to be for you an additional cause for thankfulness." These stances correspond to his, Basil's that is, overall view that, I quote, "nothing is without a cause, nothing is there spontaneously, there is a certain ineffable wisdom in all things." Almost another century later, Theodoret of Cyrus, who died around 458, proposed a very similar argument. He dismissed the possibility of useless plants by showing that some of the inedible ones were food for certain animals, and that the latter were useful to human beings in many ways, from food to clothing to work. Thus, indirectly, all the plants were useful to humankind. Also, other plants were useful for medicinal purposes. Regardless of the way in which the plants were useful, directly or indirectly, they were serviceable to our race. He argued similarly for the usefulness of wild animals, whose various parts were employed for obtaining healing substances. So, in other words, he reiterated the position of Basil. True, nature was ambivalent. There were elements such as water and fire that did good to humankind, but could also cause it great damage. But all things were ultimately useful within the overall functionality of the creation. Basil's younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa, who died around 395, developed the perspective of creation's usefulness into a veritable system of the world. Divinely set forth, the order of creation follows a natural pattern which leads from the inanimate to the conscious, progressing through the stages of mineral, vegetal, animal, and intellectual existence. Each new level possesses the qualities of the previous one, to which it adds new traits. The last three types of existence are living beings, or, as Gregory preferred, different kinds of soul. He explained that the last arrived, humanity, recapitulates and reconfigures within itself these three types of soul into a higher order. I quote, "The human being, this rational animal, mixes within itself all those forms of soul." Relevant to my purposes is Gregory's other explanation, teleological and utilitarian, that lower strands of reality are meant to serve higher forms of existence. The minerals do not just exist, they are made because of their usefulness to plants. The plants are made because they are useful to the animals. The animals are serviceable to humankind. In turn, humankind does not rule as an absolute monarch. Humankind's hegemony works through an ability to cooperate with the rest of the creation, first by taming some of its parts, and then by industriously making use of the beneficial qualities of the animals, plants, and the mineral world. This is actually people's single advantage over the animals, of which many are far stronger than the human beings, others are impossible to tame, and yet others are straightforward dangerous to them. While the world houses both humankind and the animals, cohabitation is neither easy nor uneventful. On this note, I must now turn to the early Christian perception of creation as dangerous to humankind. Several decades before Origen, who consistently defended God's justice, wisdom, and goodness, Theophilus of Antioch, who died around 180, proposed a related view, although he did not develop it as much and as well as Origen. What matters is that he believed that what caused the world's wild side, including the danger posed by certain animals, is human sin. The animals have not been made wild and dangerous. To represent this situation, he used the analogy of a household where the servants mimic the conduct of the master. He borrowed this analogy from Philo of Alexandria, the Hellenized Jew of the first century. At the root of this analogy undoubtedly lies the blessing of the sixth day of creation, by which humankind was appointed to rule over animals. Thus, animals, the servants as it were, emulate the disobedience of the human beings, their masters, towards God by becoming disobedient to people. In short, I quote, "They disobey together with the disobedient humankind." Providence made that this disturbance of the natural rhythms was neither total nor definitive. Many centuries later, Simeon the New Theologian, who died in 1022, so the end of the he lived at the end of the 10th century, in the early 11th century, proposed a similar explanation, while he produced a dramatic depiction of creation's rebellion against sinful humankind. According to him, immediately after the paradisal ancestors' fall, the world and its inhabitants either refused to provide people with means for life or attacked them. Only God's providence saved humankind from the onslaught, restoring the balance between people and the world in view of their common eschatological glorification. And while Theophilus, Origen, and Simeon understood the dangers posed to people by the wounded world as caused by their own anomalous life, undoubtedly echoing Romans 8:20, what matters is their acknowledgement that at least parts of the creation were not as welcoming to humankind as others. Theirs, however, was not the only way of representing the situation. Together with its imperfections, Athanasius, Basil, and Gregory seem to have attributed the wild and the dangerous side of things to nature itself. A tension becomes obvious at this juncture. While all these authors acknowledge the wild side of the creation, their understandings of what generates danger differ significantly. The questions with which Origen concerned himself regarding the source of imperfection, disparity, and suffering in the world return in full force. Nevertheless, this time around, these questions do not refer to the topic of a good creator whose efforts resulted in an imperfect universe. Instead, they consider the inconsistency of the traditional voices which interpret this situation. Indeed, two competing explanations have come to the fore. Certain early Christian authors, such as Theophilus, Origen, and Simeon, identified sin as the factor causing creation's dangerous wildness. For others, such as Basil and Gregory, perhaps also Athanasius, who exhibited a similar sense of the natural world, what makes parts of the world inhospitable is nature itself. Created nature, we must remember, is imperfect. The contrast is obvious, but are these positions mutually exclusive? John Chrysostom, who died in 407, implicitly demonstrated the opposite. John was troubled by the point of certain critics according to whom, while Genesis proclaims human lordship over animals, people actually fear them. This was a good reason for them to doubt the scriptural message. John wished to prove otherwise, and in so doing he arrived at an interesting solution. First, he addressed the outcomes of sin. While human rule over the world was a divine given, sin disturbed the order of things. Sin caused the loss of esteem and authority for human beings, leading in turn to their fear of animals. This conviction was widely shared by the ascetic literature of that age. Second, John showed that God made very good, tame and wild animals as well as helpful as dangerous natural phenomena. It is this balance in nature that is good, despite ambiguities. Yin and yang, one would say. John could have borrowed this conviction from Basil's similar position earlier discussed. Either way, God made the wild animals so, namely wild, before the disobedience of humankind. John's two stances that the wild side of the creation is divinely given and that sin increases nature's wildness reiterate the tension mentioned above. John chose not to address this matter up front, but since he outlined them, he could have very well considered the two positions consistent. It is not difficult to see the logic of it. The natural wildness of certain animals became dangerous to and uncontrolled by humankind because of our sin. Wildness is neither naturally threatening nor totally dangerous to human beings. Only ignorance makes people suspect that God's creation is not a good world. Indeed, people fail to grasp the divine purpose concerning the things which they deem dangerous, much the way they ignore the existence of a balance in nature. Natural phenomena, animals and plants wrongly dubbed useless or dangerous are nevertheless useful and good in the divine layout of the creation. When I will return to this paper to develop it, I mean to insert here a bit of discussion about the invisible life that the ancients didn't know of. Of course, they didn't know of bacteria and viruses and stuff. But I believe that at least the wisdom of John Chrysostom here is very relevant to our purposes, and it has a lot to teach us today about how to assess what we otherwise consider dangerous and threatening. John's conclusions coincide therefore with most of the examples discussed above, and together contribute to an overall positive, albeit complex and nuanced assessment of the world. His stances and the views of his peers also coincide with a robust tradition of natural contemplation, which discovered another aspect of creation's usefulness as a school for souls, where the believers can discern traces of God's wisdom and activity. And if you look at Basil's homilies on the Exaimeron, at least, if not any other works, you'll see how many times, and going to what detail, he praises the harmony of things, from a tiny leaf or a flower to birds, animals, woods, and so on and so forth. And he believes that all these have a double teaching to convey. One is ethical, so something we learn from the animal world and the plants about our choices in life. And another one is theological, because the entire creation points upwards towards God. Last but not least, I should point out that from Origen's homilies on Genesis onwards, almost invariably these positions paired with a sense that humankind needs to overcome its own wildness. In particular, John Chrysostom and the monastic literature emphasize the correspondence between personal tameness and the tameness of the environment. And I could give you here examples. For instance, in the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, collected between the 4th and the 6th century, or in the 6th century book written by John Moscas, The Spiritual Meadow, there are numerous examples of wildlife behaving very strangely, in a very tame way, around ascetics, particularly hermits. One might wonder, what has all this to do with the coronavirus pandemic? Rightly so. I believe that it has, that it is relevant to our current concerns and worries. Whether we like it or not, this virus, this invisible enemy, is part of God's creation. It might have mutated from some possibly benign ancestor, or it might have been all along there and we did not know. Or it might have been produced by our crafty hands, always ready to play with the fire hiding at the core of nature. One thing we know, namely, our own civilization made possible for this enemy to invade the whole world. We are irresponsible and restless. We travel everywhere because we can. We play with things because we can. And eat all things because we can. Just because we can, and just because we're worth it. L'Oréal. The ladies, I assume, know what that means. And then we all suffer the consequences, for, as our political leaders keep telling us, we are all in this. In a nutshell, the current health crisis reminds us of the early Christian discussion of creation's wild side, whose dangers our sins increase. The great difference between the early Christians and us is, we saw above, the realism of their worldview and our own unpreparedness for life. They knew the many facets of reality. In turn, people who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. Is there anything good, therefore, about the coronavirus pandemic? There might be. Take, for example, the cleanliness of the atmosphere after the lockdown, or the heroism of the health workers, or the moving expressions of human solidarity of which we have learned in the last few months. Take also the revelation of certain world leaders as stupidity and irresponsibility. Yes, lives have been lost, and life is precious. Hopefully the loss of so many lives taught us something about life's true worth. Perhaps we all learned a little more about the weaknesses of the system in which we put our trust, or in the misguided faith of those who expect only good things to happen in the best of all possible worlds. Perhaps, furthermore, people steeped in natural contemplation found theological insights behind the curtain of this tragedy. I hope that what they discovered is that the world is good, regardless of the extent of the crisis. Either way, the story whose illustrations I reviewed above remains a lesson whose wisdom we are yet to grasp.
Well, thank you very much for that, Doru. Thought-provoking and